Hi there, everyone. Thanks for joining and watching today. This is another in our continuing series of AU Passes videos. Today, we've got 10 years in the Revit API. We're excited to have Ricky Bell here. I'm Jason Kunkel. I'm with CADD Microsystems. Just real quick here about CADD. We're a consulting firm. We specialize in software, training, professional services, and BIM expertise for commercial and public sector customers in the design, build, and operate industries. We have a team of industry-recognized experts, published authors, registered architects, engineers, construction experts, and top-rated speakers at AU and Built. Our customers call us when they are frustrated with their design processes and technology and want to improve efficiency, add new capabilities, win more work, and stay competitive. We'd like to take what we call an educational approach to solving our customers' challenges and are focused on helping achieve each organization's business goals. As I just mentioned, here at CADD, education is one of our core values. We work hard to empower the design and construction community to share knowledge, to connect with one another, and we do that through platforms like this, AU Passes. The series came from feedback we got from many of our customers and their frustration at not being accepted to speak at AU, not because the presentations and ideas aren't innovative or relevant, but simply because you can only pack so much content into a 3-day conference. This is another one of our ongoing sessions. I am really excited to listen to it. We got a little preview from Ricky earlier. This is targeted, I think, for folks like me. I'm not a developer. I'm more of a high-functioning copy paster, and I think you're going to find some great tips for that if you are in the same boat. So with that, I'm going to turn that over to you, Ricky, and take it away.
All right, thank you, Jason. 10 years in the Revit API. My name is Ricky Bell. I'm a senior software engineer for the company PypeServer. I did not start off that way. I was in IT for many, many years until I got the confidence to jump into programming. And for the past 15 years, I've been programming. So I'm excited to show you a few things that I've learned while working in the Revit API, while working with Visual Studio, while deploying applications. Let's dive into it. Okay. Here's a little background on me. I got started in the Revit API as the lead developer of Victaulic tools for Revit back in 2014. This was my first introduction to C#, to using Visual Studio for enterprise level applications. That application took off. It was used as a sales tool for Victaulic while I was there, and we sold over 6,000 copies while I was there. It's still in use today. And a lot of people are glad they have it because it's a great tool for Revit, and I still highly recommend it. After I left Victaulic, I spent some time working on a project for local forma called Conduit Studio, which we ended up selling to a company called GTP. And it's now integrated with the GTP Wireworks product. So that one's in use as well today. Now, since 2021, I've been working with PypeServer. My role at PypeServer is to better connect the fabrication shops with the VDC and with the design model. So since being with PypeServer, I've developed applications for Autodesk Revit, Autodesk AutoCAD, which consumes content from AutoCAD MEP, Fabrication CAD MEP, Plant 3D, and Advanced Steel. I've also made applications for Autodesk Inventor, Allplan, SDS2, and there's more in the works. Okay. More importantly, who are you? You don't necessarily have to be an application developer. Maybe you're just starting out, or you've been developing for a few years and this is your first introduction to Autodesk Revit. There's a lot of things that you need to know that really only apply to the Revit API. So we're going to cover that today. Maybe you're looking for a shortcut. At the end of this presentation, I'll give you a link where you can download an example project that's going to have all of these concepts already implemented, but I do want to talk about them. It's important that you understand the concepts, but this project at the end of this is going to be such a shortcut. And I have some suggestions for some free tools to improve your applications. Now, you could be a VDC manager, a power user, a detailer who wants to something more, maybe, and you're brave enough to try opening up Visual Studio, creating Revit applications, and trying to run them within the Revit environment. This presentation and the coinciding link will give you everything you need to do that. Okay, so we're going to talk about couple of the lessons learned with the Revit API. We're not getting really into the details of working in, there's so much in the Revit API. This is just getting you started with a project and getting kind of a foundation for you to start building company-specific, industry-specific helpers and tools within Revit, okay? So one of the things we came across very early on with the invention of 4K monitors is that large displays really mess up the custom programming and the custom views that you've done for Revit. So we're going to talk about that and how to handle large displays. Kind of best practices we're going to talk about when you're working with the Revit API and you try to do any work in the background, it locks up the UI for the user. So you might want to consider async solutions and background workers, progress bars, to at least let your user know something is happening and they should wait and stop clicking. Okay, if you're going to deploy your application within your organization, you might want to have an installer. So we have a pre-configured installer in there. And then if you're going to deploy it outside of your organization, let's say you want to put it on the Autodesk App Store, or you want to sell it on your own platform, you want to protect your code. So we'll talk about obfuscation and then user authentication using the Autodesk Entitlement API. As far as cool tricks, one of the things we came across recently, Revit 2025 uses a completely different .NET framework. It uses .NET 8, where previous ones you can get away with .NET framework 4.8 or 4.7, whatever is appropriate for the year. How do you handle that within one Visual Studio solution? So that's going to be addressed. And then how do you handle shared code within those? Because you don't want to have a different version of your project for each version of Revit. That's impossible to maintain. And then some of the fun stuff we've been playing with at PypeServer is creating application themes. For the past few years, any application that comes out should have a dark mode. So I give you some tricks to make Revit, or your application within Revit, be able to do theming, okay? A little bit about PypeServer. If you're not familiar, PypeServer is the software that's running on those really complex plasma cutters. It's doing awesome pipe configurations. So we support a ton of different multi-axis profilers. And in the past 3 years, one of my objectives here at PypeServer is to, I wrote an application that controls straight cut linear cutters as well. So tiger stops, razor gauges, Kentucky gauges. But from left to right here, this is kind of the workflow at PypeServer. We have applications, like I mentioned before, for all of your design softwares within Autodesk and a little outside of Autodesk. They're completely free. We have a cloud interface where you can push the data you've collected in your design models. And then from the cloud interface, you can either go to PypeServer Lite for your straight cutters or PypeServer Enterprise for your plasma cutters. So we deal a lot with design groups, VDC, developing workflows, customizing workflows, and then dealing with the fabrication shop, processing, tracking, and assembling and installing all these piping systems. Here's a current list of all of the fabrication tools that we support. On the piping profiling side, Lincoln Electric, HDG, Lone Star, older pre-2000, I'm sorry, pre-2020 Watts Mueller machines, and Mashatec. These are all ones that we support. We do have workflows for automated welding as well, where we work closely with the teams at Novark and Rotoweld. And then on the straight cutting side, we currently support Tiger Stops, Kentucky gauges, razor gauge, Scotchman, NAP, their automated welder. We collect data for that, and we work directly with RMT automated cutters as well. Okay, now into the content. Any prerequisites for this? There's really not much. Maybe you have some familiarity with Visual Studio. Maybe you've just downloaded it and opened it for the first time. It's perfectly acceptable. I think that you'll still benefit from this. You will be writing a little bit of C# code, so it's important that maybe you watch a couple tutorials on YouTube if you have not gotten familiar with C#. It's a very intuitive, object-oriented programming language, and it was maybe my third or fourth language that I learned, and it was by far the easiest and by far the one that feels like you're speaking English to the computer. It's actually very intuitive in that way. And then some familiarity with Revit, just being able to use the UI, being able to draw pipe. It's important that you have a little bit of knowledge about the Revit UI. Okay. The project that you'll get a link to at the end of this presentation, the GitHub link that we'll refer to many times throughout this, is a dockable window for Revit that supports Revit 2021 through 2025. Okay, right from the dockable window, you can control the view scales using a percentage dropdown, and you can also control the color themes using a light and dark combo box. Okay. It also contains a pre-configured application installer using a free add-in for Visual Studio called Wix, W-I-X. Okay. Inside of this Visual Studio solution, you'll see 3 projects. Okay, all the way at the top, that's the installer. It's only at the top, I think, because of alphabetical order. That installer, again, it's pre-configured. It uses the Wix platform. Just an add-in for Visual Studio. Under that, example Revit Addon, that project is for .NET Framework 4.8, and this supports Revit 21 through 24. Now, with 2025 coming out that uses .NET 8, we need a separate project for that. Okay. Within your code and within your projects, there are certain things you can do to basically share your code between all of these versions of Revit. Like I said, you don't want to have different projects for each version of Revit, and each Revit API will have commands that are brand new and other ones that they're getting rid of. And you'll get notified a year in advance with Revit when that happens, but you want to be able to kind of dance around those particular situations. So here's how we do it. Under project configurations at the top center of Visual Studio, typically you'd see debug, release, and then the configuration manager. What you can do is use the configuration manager to create different configurations for each version of Revit. Within each one of those, you can control which projects get built and what versions of each project get built, because within each project, there's a configuration manager as well. Okay, so if I were to select Revit 2021, it's not going to build the project that only supports Revit 2025. Okay. Now, within each project, you're going to have to edit the project file with a text editor. This is Notepad++ on the right. And when you do your dependencies, for example, the Revit API DLL, you're going to want to point it in a conditional manner. So the configuration will need to equal Revit 2021 in order to grab the correct DLL for Revit 2021. So I hope that makes sense. There's probably 5 or 6 different DLLs that you will reference in the text, just like this. And again, it's all part of the project that I've included at the end of this presentation. Within the code, you could take advantage of preprocessor definitions. This is kind of like a step back from your code. This is telling Visual Studio what to do, not necessarily your application. So you can put if, else, if statements and say, if this is Revit 2021 or 2022, then run these lines of code, or if this is Revit 2025, run these lines of code, and everything that it doesn't find a match on will stay gray, and it actually gets excluded and ignored during when the project is compiled. Now, on the left-hand side here, you see a pane there. It says originals and linked. This is an effort to prevent duplication of code. I have all the original files that run this application in the 2021 to 2024 application, and I have linked those files in the 2025 application. This lets you use the same .cs files, C# files. It also lets you use the same XAML files. These are your views, WPF, XAML. You can use the same files, give it conditional statements to say what to do with each different version of Revit, and anytime that you make a change, it's actually applying this change to every version of Revit that you support. Okay. This is the Modeless dockable window, a little more detail here. To be able to use these, you have to actually register it on startup of your application. So you would use a command. This is widely available on the web. Jeremy Tamick with Autodesk has posted thousands and thousands of articles about, about Revit, and many of them about Modeless dockable dialogs. If I could sum it all up quick, it's that you register on startup of your application, and then give your users some way to open it back up if they close it. Okay, and that's when you would create a button within Revit, and then that button would refer to the same GUID that you use to register. So it finds the dockable panel, and then you tell the dockable panel to just show. Okay, so that's how you get it to just pop up on the screen in the first place. After that, you can drag it all around, dock it wherever you want. It's going to act exactly like your properties window or your project browser. Okay. One of the downfalls of a Modeless dockable window is that you don't have immediate access to the Revit application. Like if you try to refer to the Revit UI application, which you need to do pretty much anything, like you can't derive a document from without having access to the UI application. It just doesn't exist in this setup with this kind of window. So what you could do is use a request handler. A request handler is a separate file that you would send requests to. This request handler has access to the Revit API. So you just need to kind of wrap up all of your logic in a way that it would use this request ID. And you can populate this list, make it as long as you want for however many buttons or functions that you need to do. And then send it to the request handler using a switch case. You'll be able to run different functions at different times in your application. Now, keep in mind, this is only when you need to refer to the Revit API. If you're doing business logic and you just have things flying across the screen, or you're Googling, or not Googling, you're referencing REST APIs, you can do all of that without talking to the Revit API, and you can skip right over the request handler and treat it like any other form and function. Okay. One of the problems that we notice right off the bat when you're using a dockable window technically is a user control in the WPF library. It completely ignores your Windows zoom settings. So if you've got a 4K monitor that's set to thousands by thousands resolution, it's immediately going to pop up and be so small, and you won't be happy with it. It's going to be a tough thing to read, and you definitely don't want to roll that out to users in a way that it can't support multiple resolutions and different displays. So what I came across, this really has nothing to do with Revit as a whole. It's just a symptom of how Revit deals with user controls. I found and implemented a DPI decorator, and this basically lets the user control the scale that they want to view their dockable window in. So you can see by the illustration on the left what it looks like at 75%, 100%, 125%. WPF XAML forms are responsive by nature. So when you increase the DPI, everything should land exactly where you wanted it to in your designer. So it's handled by a third-party class called the DPI decorator, and then you would then wrap your main grid for this user control in a DPI decorator, and then tell it what to do with the scale, and the bindings are right there for you to look at. Again, also in the GitHub download, and fully functional in the GitHub download. Okay. More with the Modeless dockable dialog, and this really applies to more than just the Modeless windows. Any views that you create can be using one common XAML style file. When you create an application for working in Revit, you often don't get the app.xaml, which is by default set up for styling. You don't get that file. So I've added styles.xaml in a themes folder, and then there's a couple different ways in there to reference it depending on where you're coming from, user controls or windows. Within each one, you can have it refer to the settings of the project, and you can also, in your C# code, write to the settings of the project. So I have a variable in my default settings called color mode, and if it says light, each of these styles will do different things. So I'm controlling the background where I'll use my primary light variable, or I'll use my primary dark variable to control the color of grids. When you change the color of grids, you're also going to control the color of the controls as well. So in the application that you'll download, you'll see that there are styles set up for buttons, for drop downs, for labels. And then also I put in a style here for an image where I swap the image out. If it's in dark mode, I'm using a completely different PNG file. Okay. Another one of the items that I wanted to address is while you're working in the Revit API, it's very easy to get ahead of yourself and try to process 10,000 items all at once. If you don't give your users some sort of visual indication that you're processing items, it's going to look to them like Revit froze up. And the more they click on it, the more they're going to get that not responding up in the title bar, and it just could be bad. So one thing that I try to do with all of my applications, especially if I'm doing an API heavy task, something that may take a while, I try to use async functions. I'm either going to give them a spinner somewhere on there that says my application is doing something, stop clicking, or I'll pop up right in their face with a dialog window with a progress bar. So within this application that you receive, there is a functional progress bar where you can customize the code however you want. These two buttons illustrate what you shouldn't do and then how you should do it. The first button, the do something cool button, is just going to show you how many elements you have selected. The show progress button will actually run a progress bar without locking up the Revit UI and then show you what types of things that you've selected. So hopefully even that kind of how many things have I selected, what kinds of things have I selected, helps you, because that's one of the very first things that you end up being asked to do. Someone's going to ask you for a bill of material from Revit. That'll be the first question you get. Okay, in the background of the background worker, there's a couple things that we do here. I just want to explain this section of code here for the non-programmers out there. This is probably about as deep into the code as I'm going to get. First thing we do is we collect an iteration count. I want to see how many things that I have to process. In the code toward the top of the for loop, we want to handle what happens if the user clicks the cancel button, because we want that to be as responsive as possible. If they click the cancel button and nothing happens immediately, that's a problem. So we want that to happen quickly. And then how to refer to UI elements while we're working on a different thread, because we're getting into multi-threading here. Even though you're not controlling which thread to use, you are telling something to not run on the primary thread, and that's where Revit is. Okay, so when I refer to a message box on there, I want to use a dispatcher to be able to tell it to do things. Okay. When reporting the progress, that all is happened through a background worker, which is defined up at the top, and then the report progress is right there on the fourth arrow. And then while you're doing your work, you want to do that work within a task. Okay, and that guarantees that you're going to get better performance as well. All right. When you've gotten to a point where you've written your Revit application, you're happy with it, and you want to deploy it, you've got a couple of options. You can just copy DLLs from computer to computer. That's kind of down and dirty, but there are much nicer ways to go about it, and there are free applications that can help you. The Wix installer is it's kind of the one I chose right off the bat, but there's Inno setup and there's built-in installers with Visual Studio. Not quite as capable. Our presentation today is going to use the Wix installer. When we do that, we need an add-in file, which is basically a text file, and that's going to make its way out to Program Data, Autodesk, Revit add-ins, and then the version of Revit that you're using. And then the program files, you can really put them anywhere. Best practice is probably put them under program files. Autodesk likes you to include them in an application bundle under local app data, much like how AutoCAD plugins work. But you're the developer. You can choose where you'd like it to go. Our application is destined at the moment for the 64-bit program files. And then the add-in files have text in there that would reference back to the program files. So that's, in a nutshell, how Revit knows that you have an add-in in the first place, and how it knows where to find it, and how it knows to boot it up. Okay. Within the installer, sorry, non-programmers, I lied earlier. This is getting a little bit into coding. Within the installer, there's some cool things that you can do to handle what to happen when you upgrade your application. So that upgrade code that you see on the top right, that's going to be specific to your application for the life of the application. It's also, that section there is where you define what the version number is. Okay. Also within here, you're going to set up where to find your add-in directory. So you'll see the same path that was in the previous slide: program data, Autodesk Revit add-ins, and then the version. And I give them unique variables here, or unique properties, I guess. You'd set up your add-in directories, and you'd set up your program file directories. That's handled at the bottom, and that's the full path right there. Program files 64 folder is a Wix variable, so it knows exactly where to find that. And then you tell it which versions of Revit. You can name them whatever you want, but I made it pretty vague. So it'll be your application, example Revit add-ins / Revit 2021, something like that. Now, step 4 there to install the components. I know my code's not in the order of my arrows, but that's how you trigger off everything that's going to be processed. Those component references and the component group references are actually found in the bottom of the code, where you reference each individual file that needs to get copied. All right. When you're deploying an application to within your organization, it's not a big deal to protect your intellectual property. But if you're at all planning on sharing this with somebody else, and you're worried about someone stealing your code or your intellectual property, one of the cheap and easy things that you can do is obfuscate your code. I use a tool called Obfuscar, which is a command line obfuscation tool that you would put in the pre-build events of the installer. So back in Visual Studio, you would put that, you go to the properties of your installer, there's pre-build events, post-build events, put it in the pre-build, it says obfuscate my code. It's going to take your original DLL, run it through its obfuscation, where you can turn basically all of your English read functions and variables, it turns them into symbols and letters and makes it really difficult to be able to read your code. So it'll take that file and drop it into another folder, your obfuscated DLL, and then you'll want your installer to reference the obfuscated version of that DLL if you're going to be shipping this outside of your organization. Okay. Same thing, if you want to instill trust in your organization and in your programming, you're going to want to pick up a code signing certificate. This protects you against somebody trying to spoof your application, because you're the only one that has your code signing certificate. If you don't have one, you'll get a message like you see from user control in the bottom right here, that the publisher is unknown and we don't know what to do with this. Should we install it? Most people might just click through yes, and their IT department would yell at them. So what this does is it makes you a valid distributor of your own software and instills a little bit of confidence in the receiving party. If you're going to sell your application and post it on the Autodesk App Store, here's a link here for the documentation for the entitlement API, which is incredibly easy to use. It's a class that you bring in to your application. You give it very little information. You just give it the unique identifier of your application. And then anytime a user goes to use your application, it's going to use Autodesk's knowledge of who you are, because you have to log into Autodesk to be able to use their products. So it'll take your user account, compare it to the application you're trying to trigger, and tell you yes or no, you can use this. So you can interrupt your code at the very beginning. Let's say it's a button. They click the button. The very first thing it does is check for permission. And if it does not get permission, you can handle it with a little dialog that says, maybe a little link on there. It says, go to the Autodesk App Store to purchase this application. Okay. That was a lot. I talked straight for a long time. Here's the lessons learned. We talked about large display error. We talked about best practices with improving the user interface by using async solutions and background workers. There's a pre-configured installer in there that I suggest you really tear apart. We talked about obfuscating code and what it's like to use the entitlement API, and then a couple cool tricks. One application, one solution to be able to handle multiple years of Revit, especially with the 2025 .NET 8 split, and then a couple application themes. So, source files are up on my personal GitHub account, which anyone's welcome to download and to play around with. That's all I had.
That was awesome. Thank you. Really just a fantastic resource out there. I'm going to go, I don't think today, probably tomorrow I'll have time. I'm going to grab it and start kicking around that. I jotted down some questions as we were walking through this. It's kind of a hodgepodge here. You know, you walked through the need to support multiple versions of Revit.
Right.
Obviously, you don't need to go back to, like, 2010 or 2015.
Sure.
But in 10 months or so, we're going to have 2026. What, just real high level, what does it look like when it's like time to get 2026 and maybe drop off 2021?
Right. I'm going to make a grand assumption here that 2026 still uses .NET 8. Okay. And knowing what I know about the .NET framework, let's say .NET 9 comes out and it uses .NET 9. It should be backwards compatible. So what you would do is you would just add new lines of code to your project configuration. So you create a project configuration for it, and then you go into each project with the text editor, like I said, Notepad++, and you would add references to the new DLLs. And then you can go into your C# code using preprocessor definitions, like I described earlier, and add in lines that would say, if Revit 26, do this. Now, one thing that we came across years ago when I was at Victaulic is we needed to continue to support a legacy version of Revit. We used Revit 2017 for one project that lasted for 5 years. So this is the flip side to your question. What happens if my organization is stuck with Revit 17 because we've been working on the same building for years? You would add those particular DLL references to the .NET 4.8 project that's in there. So the legacy project, you can still add on the previous years. I picked Revit 2021 as a good starting point, but since I've been at PypeServer, we support all the way back to 2018. So it's easy enough to apply the same configurations for 2026, or to go backwards and support Revit 18 if you needed to.
Awesome, perfect, thank you. Some random things popping up in my head. What was your, maybe the most recent, but what's your biggest surprise about the Revit API?
Oh, the transition from Revit 2014 to 15 was probably the hardest and the one that took the longest. And that's what really introduced me to using async functions in background workers. That's really the first instance where I came across my application crashes Revit in 2015, but not 2014. So when Revit makes these grand changes, you have to be nimble and you have to be good at Googling, because it took a while to get across that particular one. So as far as biggest surprise goes, I'm going to say there's a positive surprise as well. There's a ton of documentation. I've ventured myself into different worlds of development, and sometimes there's no resources out there. But with Revit, there's just a ton. Just Google Revit API and your question, and you will absolutely find 100 people who had the same issue and one really smart guy, because that's really all we need is one really smart guy to offer the answer, and you just copy paste into your project.
Awesome, perfect, I love it. Kind of along those lines, do you have a favorite place you like to go to kind of keep up to date or get new resources or learn new stuff?
Right. So Autodesk has its own forum where you earn points for every question that you answer, every question that people care to say you had the answer for. So you earn these kudos points. So that's absolutely a place to go. A user-managed website, which is really awesome, is revitapidocs.com. Because if you're using the .chm helper, the documentation for the Revit API, That's a little 1995-ish, and it's a little tedious to work in. So what they did is they took those help files, they put them up on the web, and then they allow their own users, like a community, to submit code samples for each of these members, classes, properties, things like that. That's been a huge help as well.
That's awesome. Looking through this, it certainly feels like a lot of these solutions come out of necessity. You hit a problem, you probably develop from there. I think we've probably got a handful of folks who are watching this who are very interested in starting development. They might have an idea, but they don't know how to begin. Kind of kicking back, you said you didn't start off in development. One or two things that you would encourage your past self to do first when you were starting out in Revit development?
Yeah. Well, when I got into development as a whole, it was out of necessity. I was the IT guy for a car dealership, and they said, we need a database to be able to handle all of our, they're like, who should we hire to handle all of the sales and the repossessions and all the intricacies of being a car dealer? Who should we hire was their question. I'm like, well, no one but me. I went out to Barnes & Noble in 2002 or 3 or something, and I started buying books and reading. I don't think that's necessary anymore. I was able to gain that job and keep the money from going to somebody else was really the goal. I use YouTube a lot as a reference for everything. If I'm fixing my furnace or if I'm programming something, there's something on there for everybody. So if I were to go back to 2014, when I was presented with a new programming language, a new platform, I would say don't be afraid to ask for help. And more specifically, don't be afraid to ask for help from somebody outside your organization. Jeremy Tamick, like I mentioned, has been a great resource. He's been the one resource, and I would be happy to pick up if anybody has any questions. These are things that really drive me and excite me. So if you are working on a Revit application, you're new to it, and my email address is right there, I'd be happy to be a resource as well.
Awesome. Very, very generous. Appreciate it. Yeah, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up now. So with that, we want to thank you all for joining us. We've got some links here about how you can get in touch with us. If you've got some ideas you want to get for an AU Pass, and we will certainly take some of those links that we had in the presentation and stick them in the comments here. Wrapping up, this is part of our BIMXT network. It's another way we try to bring people into the community and educate the community. We have our BIMXT network, the LinkedIn pages. Please feel free to hop in and join the conversation and see other resources that we're sharing there. We have Zoom meetings quarterly with BIMXT Online, where we're able to present some really advanced and some really good topics about the design technology, about construction technology from top presenters literally all across the world. And then we also, in addition to that, have our 7-city in-person BIMXT meetings where we like to get together and have a meal and talk about the industry and things that are going on. But with that, another big thank you to Ricky for your time, and thanks to everyone for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next time.